one of those cultural sea changes that happened in this election. The legacy media just didn't matter. And what mattered instead were these podcasts.
My message now is, sort of it's bad news and good news. The bad news is that legacy media really can't be fixed because it's so ideological. The good news is it doesn't matter. Nobody cares. Hello, and welcome to Think Twice. This week, we have an important conversation about the presidential election results, as well as the prospects for the second Trump administration with author Matt Continetti. But before we start today's program, I want to remind you, as always, to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. Also, if you still don't have to wait a full week for more of our content, there is a Jonathan Tobin daily podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the Daily Show under Jonathan Tobin Daily on the JNS channel, wherever you get your podcasts. And now to today's program. In the 2 weeks since Donald Trump won the 2024 election, there have been no shortage of theories seeking to interpret the results. Some on the left are blaming the electorate for being too racist and misogynist to vote for Vice President Kamala Harris, and are doubling down on charges that the Republican Party has embraced fascism. Others see it as a reason for Democrats to listen to the voters and swing back to the center, discarding the intersectional left and the extremism of woke ideology, something that many party activists now see as heresy. Meanwhile, many on the right believe the election was a mandate for full implementation of Trump's agenda, though whether Republicans are united enough behind the new president to accomplish anything close to that is an open question. What is clear is that Trump has no intention of allowing the vestiges of the old GOP establishment that pursued economic, social, and foreign policy positions that he and his voters oppose to stop him. Similarly, as his cabinet picks demonstrate, he's equally determined to fulfill his vow to dethrone the administrative state and the federal bureaucracy, which is overwhelmingly liberal and supportive of the Democrats, to sabotage his second administration, as it did his first, as their bolstering of the Russian collusion hoax and slow walking and obstruction of his policies from 2017 to 2020 showed. Whatever else it meant, Trump's win was a defeat for the Washington establishment on both domestic and foreign policy. At home, that means a serious effort to end illegal immigration and roll back the left's culture war against Western civilization via the woke catechism of DEI that is destroying American education and fueling hatred for Israel, along with a surge in anti-Semitism. Abroad, it means a realistic approach to Europe, Ukraine, and Russia, and a reversal of the Biden administration's attempt to revive the Obama agenda in the Middle East, which was predicated on undermining Israel and appeasing Iran. Will Trump succeed? We don't know. But what is certain is that the election represented a fundamental realignment of the American electorate, with working-class voters abandoning the Democrats and embracing the GOP, while the credentialed elites solidified their embrace of the Democrats. That's a basic fact about the results that many pundits downplay or refuse to acknowledge. And until they do, Republicans won't fully understand the opportunity they've been handed by the voters, and Democrats won't fix the problems that lost them the presidency and the Senate. It means changing the way we think about terms like conservative and liberal, as well as what it means to be pro-Israel or opposed to anti-Semitism. To take a deep dive into these questions and ponder the meaning of the election, as well as what it portends for the future, we're pleased to have with us today one of the foremost thinkers about conservatism and American politics today. Matthew Continetti is the Director of Domestic Policy Studies and the Chair in American Prosperity at the American Enterprise Institute. He was the founding editor of the Washington Free Beacon and is now also a columnist for Commentary Magazine and frequently appears on the Fox News Channel. He is the author of 3 books, The Persecution of Sarah Palin, The K Street Gang, and most recently the 2022 The Right, The 100-Year War for American Conservatism. Matthew Continetti, welcome back to Think Twice.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Matt, thanks so much for joining us today. I want to start by asking you about the nature of what you referred to in commentary as the new Republican majority. Realignment is a term that is often thrown around loosely, but we have seen something like that building in recent years. And I think it's now irrefutable that Trump won as a result of working class voters embracing the GOP or his GOP, while the Democrats have become the party of the credentialed elites and the very poor. What does this portend for both parties as well as the future of American politics?
Well, it's a wonderful question and a very wide-ranging one. I mean, I think one of the most remarkable findings in this election is that Donald Trump, while winning the popular vote for the first time for a Republican in 20 years, expanded his coalition from 2016. In 2016, when Donald Trump won the presidency, quite surprisingly to many observers, he won it by massive majorities among the so-called white working class, white voters without college degrees throughout the country. 8 years later, he maintained support among the white working class, but he also built up support among the non-white working class, minority voters without college degrees, in particular Hispanic voters. And what we've seen during the course of the Trump era, which for me really begins about 10 years ago or more, is that Hispanic voters are drifting toward the GOP. They're attracted to, I think, the message of opportunity that Donald Trump discusses. They're repelled by the left's cultural progressivism. And they're also strong believers in illegal migration. And they don't like what's happened to the country during the course of 4 years of Joe Biden's open borders. So Donald Trump has expanded the Republican coalition. It is now a multiracial, multi-ethnic working class coalition. And the real question for the Republican Party is, can Donald Trump's successors maintain this coalition for 8, 12 years from now? And of course, we don't know whether that will turn out to be the case or not.
Yeah, I think, the Trump victory and his ideas to fundamentally reform or change or burn down, depending on how you want to define it, the federal government, raises the question of whether any attempt at dethroning the D.C. establishment, the federal bureaucracy, from the position of power it's attained in the last century can work under any circumstance. Can, given a second chance, Trump's populist push succeed where other conservatives, including people like Ronald Reagan, fell short?
A few things are different between this incoming Trump term and the first Trump term. Whereas you say, Jonathan, Donald Trump's priorities were basically the same in 2017 as they are today. Reduce illegal immigration, secure America's position in the world, bring peace, promote economic growth, and most importantly, economic opportunity for the working classes, and deconstruct the administrative state is how the members of the Make America Great Again movement put it.
Which I would add has become sort of a fourth,
Unelected branch of government, right?
Unelected branch of government.
The regulators, the bureaucrats.
They make the laws
and
more
then
than the
within
Congress
that,
does.
You have what Trump calls the deep state, which are the national security officials who have worked against him under cover of security clearances for many years. So he had the same priorities, but it was a record of mixed success, I think, in particular in his attempts to deconstruct the administrative state, reduce bureaucracy, get out above or in front of all of the scandals and controversies involving the national security agencies as well. So what's different this time? Well, I think the first difference is Donald Trump is experienced. He had 4 years in office, and even though that last year in office was, of course, dominated by the COVID-19 pandemic, you could see toward the end of his last year in office, 2020, that he was becoming much more familiar and comfortable with the levers of presidential power. And had he won in 2020 a second term, which he came very close to doing, I think you would have seen a more emboldened Trump, a more effective Trump in corralling the federal bureaucracy. So he's experienced. The second thing is he has a team. In 2017, Donald Trump's election was such a shock to the system that Trump had to rely on many figures staffing his agencies and cabinet posts who were part of the system, who knew the system, and Trump had to work with them. Sometimes it was very effective. Other times it was not effective at all, and it led to a lot of internal clashes and I think policy and personnel failures. This time, it's just clear watching Trump, watching the transition, watching his movements with the posse he has around him. He has a team, and they are putting in place people who are, above all, loyal to Donald Trump, who are very good communicators of his worldview, and who also share his view that this election was a mandate for Trump to essentially turn DC upside down. And so I think these differences may make Trump more effective, at least in the first 100 days of his presidency, than he was during the first term. But I do have to caution everyone, there are a lot of unknowns here. You know, Trump has a trifecta, which is
Known
very
unknowns,
important.
we might say.
Then you're right, the known unknowns. And unknown unknowns. Trump has a trifecta which will help him. That is, Republicans will control the House and the Senate. But I do think about Richard Nixon in 1972. He was elected with a huge landslide, really a repudiation more of the Democrats than endorsement of Richard Nixon. Now, he did not have control of the Congress, but he was a very experienced political player. And very soon after he began his second term, he was ensnared with the Watergate plot. And you can see how Trump's enemies in D.C., even though they are shocked and rattled at the moment, I think will work quickly to undermine his presidency as best they can.
Yeah, well, I'll get to a question about, what will the nature of the resistance be, this time a little later. But I guess first, in terms of the Republicans, the question is, can a Republican Party led by Trump govern effectively if he and his voters kind of want to burn it down, or at least fundamentally change, Washington? Well, Republican office holders, certainly the Congress that was elected with him, some of whom are kind of full-blown MAGA or going along, and some of whom, especially in the Senate, are not. Like, how does that work? And we're going to obviously see that as, the cabinet approvals play a
Sure.
part in that.
Well, I think on the whole, this Congress, this Republican Congress next year, will be closer to Donald Trump than the Republican Congress that he had in 2017. That Republican Congress in 2017 was still very much dominated by individuals who belonged to the Republican Party pre-Trump. Now you look at the Republican Party in the House. Speaker Mike Johnson was elected in 2016, the same year that Donald Trump won election. He leads a party in the House that is very much aligned with Donald Trump. Some of its members are more Trump than Trump, right? And that's really the dividing line there in the Republican conference in the House. The Senate's somewhat different, but you look at the fact that Mitch McConnell is no longer going to be the Republican leader. He's replaced by his protege, John Thune. But even Thune, the senator from South Dakota, much more open to Trump's agenda than his predecessor. And you look at other rising stars in the Senate GOP conference, like Tom Cotton. He's now the number 3 in the Senate leadership, and he's also going to be the chair of the Intel Committee when Marco Rubio resigns to be confirmed, as he will undoubtedly be confirmed as Secretary of State. So, and you also, in addition, you have Republican senators elected in the years since Trump came to Washington, especially this class coming in with him, Tim Sheehy of Montana in particular, Bernie Moreno of Ohio is another one. They are very MAGA. So I think you're going to have a harmony of interests for the most part, which will help Trump. But as you say, for a lot of Trump supporters, when they hear governing, they think that that's a synonym for business as usual. And so many Trump supporters, for them,
And to
the
be fair,
controversy is a
that's
plus.
often how it has worked.
Exactly right. Yeah, exactly right. And so the
Let's
controversies,
extend the debt.
Yeah,
let's
right.
spend more money.
the controversies, the confrontations, the fights, that to MAGA is a symbol that you're doing something right. And I think most of Washington looks at it and says, oh no, that's awful. Everything's falling apart. When in fact, this movement that has been building now, I think, since the global financial crisis of 2008, and that found Donald Trump as its leader in 2015, 2016, they want to shock the system. They want to produce controversy because it means that the powers that be in Washington are unsettled, are on their toes.
Yeah, one of the really interesting things, and it's more than sort of the future of the Democrats, which we can get into, is does this election, as you alluded, the fact that Trump did so well in the Hispanic vote, won Hispanic male voters. Does this mean that as a society and as a culture, we're moving away from race as the defining issue of politics, which in 2020, during the moral panic of, after, the Black Lives Matter summer, it seemed to be?
Yes, I think we are depolarizing on race and ethnicity, and polarizing around education in particular. And that's the new dividing line: education and then religion, which has been a long-standing dividing line between the two parties. And what it gets to, I think, is the Republican Party is become the party of Americans of every race and ethnicity and creed who believe in traditional America, right? Who believe in certain things. There should be a border. Who believe that there are biological men and women, and that biological boys should not play in girls' sports. Who
That
believe,
ad that appeared, like, if you
yes,
watch the baseball playoffs or
right,
the NFL was ubiquitous, certainly in
and
the
very
in
effective. Yeah.
yes.
Who, by the way, Americans who support the state of Israel and believe that there is a fundamental connection between the United States and the Jewish state. That, I think, is a not remarked on enough theme in this campaign. To Donald Trump's position on Israel, abundantly clear to all. Kamala Harris's position, hidden like so many other of her views. So when you look at traditional America, pre-Great Awakening America, they have moved to the Republican Party pretty significantly. Maleness, the idea of masculinity, which had been kind of attacked for 20 years or so, is now rearing back. And you see it with Donald Trump visiting the Ultimate Fighting Championship. You see it with kind of the football players and boxers who are doing the Trump dance.
Right.
And then, you see it among young men, in particular, young men really kind of embracing Trump as kind of a way of sticking it to the man, so to speak. And Trump's, of course, signature moment, I think, in his political career, even his life, when he was shot in July, his immediate reaction was to expose himself again and to say, fight, fight, fight. So that kind of ethos is now infusing the Republican Party, quite unexpectedly, I'd say, and it has had the effect of actually rejuvenating the Republican Party. And I think putting the Democrats in this position where they really don't know what's up and what's down.
Yeah, I think it's a real disconnect, I think, for a lot of traditional Republican pundits as well as, sort of liberal Democrats was this, the assumption of many was that, well, this is an election that a Nikki Haley could win easily, but Trump will struggle. I think that's actually wrong. I think Trump's appeal, his broad-based appeal is something that traditional Republicans, especially somebody like Nikki Haley, not to sort of dump on her, very, it's substantial figure, but she seemed to me to be running for the 2012 Republican presidential nomination, not the one for 2024. And that leads me to talk about the future, which you alluded to before, and its personification in J.D. Vance. Is his rise to the vice presidency a sign not just of like how one guy, went from from a standing stop 4 years ago, like nowhere, no office, to, seemingly the next president. But is it also the ascension of a more common good kind of conservatism on domestic issues and realism abroad over, say, the Bush era GOP and Nikki Haley. And even though it's too early to talk about 2028, is he really in position to continue the fundamental makeover of the Republicans?
Well, I do think that when Trump chose J.D. Vance, he was actually looking for similar characteristics that you see in some of his cabinet picks. He was looking for a loyalist. He was looking for youth. He was looking for someone young. And he was looking for a good communicator of the MAGA worldview. J.D. Vance fit all those qualities, and I have been struck by his impressive turn on the campaign trail. Remember, when Vance was selected at the outset of the Republican National Convention in July, 48 hours after Donald Trump was shot in Butler, Pennsylvania, a lot of people were a little bit puzzled by the pick. They didn't think necessarily that it would be the strongest pick. It was certainly not the conventional pick. It was a choice that was made out of, I think, confidence in the election, and definitely a sense that Trump wanted to put his stamp on the party in 2028 and beyond by choosing his protege, one of his proteges, J.D. Vance. And then immediately J.D. Vance was hit with this whole childless cat ladies controversy, right? And he took a pretty strong dive in public favorability. What's remarkable is that in some of these exit polls from Election Day, the only person with a positive favorable rating of the four candidates was J.D. Vance. And I think that's because he showed over the course of the campaign a resilience, a fluency, a certain demeanor, a calm that really impressed people, especially during the vice presidential debate with Tim Walz, where I think America, if you tuned into that debate, you saw someone who you were not expecting and you liked. J.D. Vance came across in that debate as someone who was very smooth, who was very much aware of the details of policy, but could communicate his story and how government relates to everyday people very well. And so, yes, I do think he is absolutely the front runner for the 2028 Republican nomination. That does not mean no one will challenge him, but he does start off as a front runner. And I do think, just to answer your second question, Jonathan, if he does win the nomination and if he does win election as president, then yes, absolutely. The conservatism will continue to move in this populist direction, more culturally conservative, more non-interventionist in foreign policy, and more, I think, willing to use government power to make the lives of working people better. Now, on those last two parts, there are always, unforeseen circumstances. There are always unplanned consequences of your actions. And as someone who is more of a traditional conservative, I especially worry about government intervention in the economy, often leading to perverse outcomes and only making problems worse. However, that J.D. Vance and I disagree on that, and he's the one who's going to be the vice president and the front runner for the Republican nomination. So we'll see how it turns out, right?
Right, exactly. On the other end of that spectrum, since 2016, there has certainly, as a force in the media, if not in electoral politics, the sort of, bitter end, sort of the last remnants of the old Republican Party who did not accept Trump have been a factor. And, I'm referring to sort of the never Trump faction. Ben Domenech, somebody we both know, has written a piece saying, they're done, they're finished. That seems to me fairly persuasive because, I think actually, sort of the never Trump as an electoral factor was never significant. Trump, I think in all three elections has gotten, an astounding percentage of the Republican vote, higher than most. I think maybe even Reagan did, back in the 80s, or at least as good. But, are they going to continue as a factor in the media, if not in elections?
Well, I think what happened was that by the end of the campaign, the Never Trump movement had become pretty well integrated into the Democratic Party apparatus. And of course, this was symbolized by Kamala Harris's embrace of former Congresswoman Liz Cheney, and the touting of the endorsement of Liz Cheney and former Vice President Dick Cheney, and appearing alongside Liz Cheney, appearing alongside other members of the Never Trump movement on the campaign trail. So when I think about that group today, I really just think of them as kind of Democrats. They're part of the Democratic Party.
Which some of them are now, literally, and some are just still claiming to be something else.
Or you say you're an anti. I mean, to be an anti-Trump Republican? What does that mean? You can still be that, of course, but it doesn't give you much purchase, I think, in American politics today, and definitely not for the next 4 years.
Yeah. Well, there were liberals who were against Reagan, too, liberal Republicans who were against Reagan, but they were consigned to sort of the dust heap of history, and I expect.
Well, I think just to bring that up, Jonathan, there's clearly I do want to say there's still many Republicans, including Republicans in Congress and in the states, who they know that Donald Trump is this very important historical figure, right, and the leader of the Republican Party, but they may not agree with him on everything.
Right.
So I think the real difference is, are you willing to say, okay, Donald Trump is Donald Trump. I have different views, say, on trade. Maybe I have different views on legal immigration. I have different views on foreign policy, but I'm willing to argue about those views with the Trump movement, recognizing that Trump is the leader. Or do you just simply reject Trump as a whole, and you believe all Republicans are somehow corrupted by him? I think that's the real dividing line. And that second group I mentioned, there's nowhere for them in the Republican Party today.
Yeah. I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole of the Trump cabinet picks question, because there's so many other interesting things for us to talk about. But I guess briefly, do you think he's playing 4D chess with Matt Gaetz or some of these others? Or is this just what he wants?
Well, we know that
or can it be both? I don't know.
Yeah, sometimes it ends up looking like 4D chess in retrospect, right? I think what we know about President Trump is he likes to improvise. He goes with his gut. He makes snap decisions. And in this case, it seems to me, based on the reporting, that Matt Gaetz was not in the running up until really the day he was selected as the nominee for Attorney General. And Trump went with his gut there because he sees Matt Gaetz as someone very much like himself, someone who is dead set against the Washington establishment, someone who has been ensnared by that establishment, right, and has kind of the scars to prove it.
Yes, if you don't believe his colleagues in Congress who think he's as bad as, sort of the liberal media says.
Right. But then someone also who is willing to be disliked, right? I mean, the thing about Trump is he's never been anything but himself. There's one change between 2016 to 2020 and this past election, 2024, is that in 2024, as Trump he's gotten older, as we all have, but his campaign did try to emphasize his more personal qualities. Having his granddaughter speak at the convention, going on these podcasts where he would talk for hours, oftentimes about his life. And so, but he's always him. There's no, there's no,
right. No, he's authentic.
No gloss,
that is
right?
part of his appeal.
Exactly, right.
He's Whether you hate him or love him,
and I think Gaetz is something of the same way, to be honest. Matt Gaetz is who he is. And you either despise him, as many people in Washington do, or
especially Republicans.
Especially Republicans. Or you kind of like him and you think that he's a fighter and he's on your side. So Trump can see and identify with Gaetz. And he also knows that he can trust Gaetz to be a loyalist if he gets that position of Attorney General. So I think for all those reasons, Trump made this decision very rapidly, and he put it out there. And for me, watching all these nominations, but especially really the 4, maybe 5 controversial ones, it's a question of, do they make it to next year? Do they make it to when the Senate is sworn in, the new Senate, the new Congress is sworn in January 3rd, a few weeks before the inauguration? If these nominees are still in the mix by then, I believe they'll actually be confirmed.
Yeah, well, we'll see. I think Gates is, maybe, to quote myself, though I think he may be a bridge too far, but most of the others, I think their chances are good. Now, one other part of really a change that is going on that this election, sort of solidified is it was also sort of a verdict on the bankruptcy of a lot of the mainstream legacy media in an election that was not only repudiation of their worldview, but it was more about podcasts than corporate outlets and newspapers and broadcast channels, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. And I think this is, again, one of those cultural sea changes that happened in this election that kind of came up uh, uh, behind everyone and took us by surprise, that the legacy media just didn't matter. And what mattered instead were these podcasts, were these influencers who are not even necessarily political, right? But they have a certain um, uh, openness to political figures and willingness to talk about topics that can touch on politics. And so you see just how successful, I think, the Trump strategy of really kind of avoiding the legacy media and going straight to voters through these podcasts was. And I do think that the Joe Rogan interview and endorsement did play a role in the
Yeah.
final days of this
A lot
campaign.
more than a Washington Post editorial would
You're
have.
right, or lack thereof, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and, the fact that Trump could sit there for 3 hours and talk to Joe Rogan, and 30 million people watched in the first 24 hours, that's incredible, and especially when contrasted with Kamala Harris, who, of course, could not do that for 3 hours because what would she say? There are only so many times you can go through your cliches, right? I grew up in a
Yeah.
middle-class family. You can't say that for 3 hours long. People would get bored out of their minds. So, I think that helped. I think it reinforced this movement toward the new media, toward YouTube. And I see this in my own family. I have 2 kids. They don't watch television anymore. They watch YouTube. And to the degree that they watch programs that are on legacy broadcast media, it's because they're on streamers now. So
Mm.
we see that politics in 2024 is catching up with these trends in the culture that were kind of just below the surface, whether it was cord cutting or whether it was kind of a rejection of the liberal political correct line, especially on questions regarding um, gender, masculinity and femininity. Those things just kind of, I think, came into full view in the election result. And I think both parties are going to have to spend some time figuring out where they stand in relation to these new trends.
Yeah, I think that's very true, and, it's sort of in when I go out and I meet people and, talk to audiences and, it's often they wanna talk about the bias and the media bias against Israel, for example, and my message now is, sort of it's bad news and good news. The bad news is that the legacy media really can't be fixed because it's so ideological. The bias is baked in, whether it's about Israel, whether it's about politics. The good news is it doesn't matter. Nobody cares.
Right.
And that you should be looking at other media, new media, and, and then scrutinizing them rather than being obsessed about what the New York Times is doing every day.
Yeah, one thing we haven't mentioned too is the power of X, formerly Twitter, under Elon
Yes.
Musk. How Musk, what a story there. His entry into American politics, and then also turning X into a massively important media outlet. And just in relation to Israel, which of course I'm always paying attention to as well. I mean, think about Senator John Fetterman of Pennsylvania, how much he has helped the pro-Israel community through his voice on Twitter or X, right? I mean,
Mhm.
combating anti-Semitism, combating the lies about Israel. See, a post on a social media now, I think, goes a lot farther than the traditional op-ed. Now, as a writer of op-eds, that leaves me in a funny position because I
Yeah,
have
we're
to now.
both we're we're
Yeah,
both wor yeah.
yeah, we're dinosaurs. Yeah,
Yeah. Well, we have to adapt.
exactly.
I think
Right.
we're both
They're
trying, but
trying hard. Yeah.
that's the point, that the media is changing just as print was replaced by online, and now, what we think of online websites aren't important. It's, it's podcasts and video, which is
Or
what we
newsletters
do,
too. I mean,
and newsletters and what
yeah,
we're doing right now.
exactly.
So Turning to the Democrats briefly, because there are other things we want to talk about, they're mulling a postmortem about their defeat, but are obviously divided between those on the left who are damning the results as a verdict on American racism and misogyny, if not embrace of fascism, and pragmatists who say they should listen to the voters and move to the center. Now, throughout American history, both parties have always tended toward the latter strategy to recoup their losses. Question is, can the Democrats do that today, with sort of an activist base that is so deeply enmeshed in sort of the ideology that inclines them to think that the problem is America and not themselves?
I think it's going to be hard. I really do. I think one of the reasons it's hard is because the Democratic Party is now the party of affluent, graduate degree holding white voters. And what we know about rising levels of educational attainment is that it means you're also much more constrained in your worldview. You become more ideological the higher levels of education you acquire, and you also become more attached to that ideology and less able to see the alternatives or even to hold contradictory positions like many people do all the time. So this is a big problem for the Democratic Party. They have to somehow reconnect with their roots as the party of the working man and woman. And how do they do that when they're so dominated by institutions that are culturally progressive and that are removed and insulated from the working class? I have been amused and also alarmed at the message coming from Senator Bernie Sanders, who is saying, well, the reason the Democrats lost was because we lost working class people. True. But then Bernie Sanders goes on to say, and the way we get the working class people back is by being more socialist. No, not at all. That's not. But you
Yeah.
look at the groups who have moved toward the Republican Party in recent years, it is because they are rejecting socialism, in particular Hispanic communities. When you think about Cuban Americans, Venezuelan immigrants to this country, people have had to deal with the chaos in Central America stemming from the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. They hate socialism. There's nothing about it that they will like. So if the Democrats go the Bernie Sanders route, as some people are urging them to do, I think they're in for a long period in the wilderness.
Yeah, it is a question, and I'm not sure we can resolve it, whether there's going to be a true resistance to Trump on the left. And I guess as we learned the day that we're taping this, that if the Morning Joe team of Joe and Mika can go to Mar-a-Lago
I know.
to kiss the new president's
What is
ring
that
and to
about?
talk peace after,
Oh, did you hear them describe it? It was like it was some kind of diplomatic back channel. Like, it was Brzezinski talking to the Soviets through some Egyptian mediator. It was
mediator.
bizarre. Yeah.
Yeah, so after calling him, Hitler and a
Oh,
fascist, they're doubling
fascist,
down on
Nazi.
it.
Yeah.
So I wonder about that. But let's turn to foreign policy. And I guess it's a fundamental question. Do you think Trump 2.0 is about isolationism or is it realism? Certainly
It's realism. Yeah.
his new administration is certainly set up to be pro-Israel, but I guess the question is, can a policy that is tough on Iran and China be compatible with stepping back with conflict with Russia and settling Ukraine? What's your
Well,
idea
Trump seems
there?
to think so. I don't know whether in reality that will prove to be the case, because what we've seen under Joe Biden is the integration of America's enemies into an axis of authoritarians that, of course, China is the banker, the financier, the tech producer. What Russia is providing troops in Ukraine, Iran providing technology and arming the proxies throughout the Middle East, and now North Korea also providing troops and ammunition. So it's hard to, I think, to separate these powers and these threats. What we do know is that the Trump cabinet, the national security side of it, is extremely pro-Israel, extremely hawkish and tough on Iran, is hawkish toward China, and is of the view that peace needs to come to Ukraine, Russia. So what does hawkish mean? And that's my first point, is hawkish means tough. It doesn't mean necessarily that you're going to start wars, but it means that you want to get into a position, especially on some of these economic issues vis-a-vis China, where American leverage is exercised, right? And you were able to restore deterrence, which has been lacking from America, I believe, since the Afghan withdrawal in 2021. So that's hawkishness. Number two is Ukraine-Russia. Trump and Putin apparently have talked since the election. And what we know of that conversation, it's sketchy, but we do know that Trump may have told Putin to not to escalate the war until Trump comes into office. Well, how did Putin respond? With one of the largest barrages of missiles on Ukraine, by arming 10,000 North Koreans in Russia and possibly many more to take back the region known as Kursk, which the Ukrainians captured quite surprisingly earlier this year. So the question then is, what will Trump do when Russia doesn't listen to him? And we just don't. We don't know. And I have a feeling that it's going to be much harder to end the Ukraine war than many people in America and in Europe would like to think.
Well, that may be so. I guess, though, there is a fundamental question when you say that all of these conflicts, the Iranian proxy wars against Israel and the war against Ukraine are the same thing, when they're not the same thing. Now Ferguson talks about a new Cold War, and I think he's probably right. The historian Niall Ferguson, for those who don't know. But not every proxy war during the first Cold War was a great idea. So, as America learned to its sorrow in Vietnam. So it's possible to try to settle Ukraine in a way that is different from the way we need to settle with Iran. I guess.
Well,
that would be my
absolutely.
point.
Of course. I mean, I don't think anyone, or certainly if
Because
anyone
Russia
called
can't be
for,
abolished Russia can't be thrown
yes,
out of Europe. I mean,
yes. I mean, no, it can't. But my point is, in order to settle that war between Ukraine and Russia, you need both parties to somehow agree to settle it.
yeah.
And
Well, we'll see.
I don't see either one that interested in that at the moment.
Yeah, well, we'll see how Trump handles that. Matt, I wonder, before I let you go, I know a lot of people who loved your book on the right, The History of American Conservatism, want to know what your next big project is. If there is another big project in the works, tell us about that, if there is one.
Well, at the moment, I'm spending most of my time trying to just make sense of this election and this world, Jonathan. But, a thought had occurred to me is that I have written about conservatism, but one, I think, story out of this election is just how corrupted American liberalism became. And I think that story, too, might be worth investigating and researching and telling down the line.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's a project that I think all of us who are engaged in the world of ideas right now need to focus on whether liberalism in terms of its 19th century meaning can be defended, which
Yeah.
has been very much called into question by the woke tide that has swept through America. Well, Matt, thanks so much for joining us today. You can read Matt in Commentary Magazine. Follow him on X at @Continetti. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Jonathan Tobin Daily Edition, whether you're listening to us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, Music, or any of the other podcast platforms, or watching us live on Facebook or X, or on the JNS YouTube channel. Please like and/or subscribe to JNS. Click on the bell for notifications and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. Thanks so much, and remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.